Good afternoon, dear friends. We are coming to the third session of the conference and the first session of this afternoon. To those of you who didn't attend the morning sessions, I would like to introduce myself first. My name is Wu Chun, the president of China National Institute for South China Studies and also the chairman of the advisory board of ICAS. The topic of this session is the South China Sea issue. As Professor Norquist and Ambassador Bolton just touched upon many times of South China Sea issue. As we know, the South China Sea dispute is one of the issues that affect U.S.-China relations, among others, such as the trade dispute, Taiwan issue, and North Korean nuclear programs. Let's take a look at the current situation of the South China Sea. From my own perspective, it has been relatively peaceful and stable compared with that of the period of the year 2013 to 2016. When we suffered the chaos of the South China Sea caused by such scenarios as arbitration case, land reclamation, and the FNOPS in the South China Sea region. But now, objectively speaking, the overall situation in the South China Sea is still worrisome, since the fundamental issues territorial disputes, overlapping maritime claims are still there, despite China and 10 ASEAN member countries are focusing their attention on the COC consultation and negotiations. And the Maritime Cooperation is underway and is going to be promoted in the future. So that's why we set up a special session of the annual conference of ICAS to address the South China Sea issue. Fortunately, we have 4 brilliant panelists in this session who are Jackie Deliso. He has a very nice Chinese name, Deji, who is from University of Pennsylvania, Mark Zulumek from U.S. Coast Guard, and Rupert Williams from Yale University Law School, and Hong Nong, she's from ICAS. So without further delay, I would like to give the floor to our speakers to address relevant issues respectively. Jackie, you are the first.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Wu Sun and Hong Nong as well, and the co-sponsors of this event. So in that great product of U.S.-China interaction that is the fortune cookie, at lunch today I got, you will be fortunate in the opportunities presented to you. And this is certainly one of them, so I'm delighted to have a chance to speak with you about this. I would agree with what President Wu just said, that this has been a quiet phase in the South China Sea, certainly compared to a time that I'd take actually back to around 2010. We don't have or even 2009, we don't have the submission of positions to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. We haven't had the standoff in Huangyan Scarborough. We haven't had an oil rig being the focus of controversies off the coast of Vietnam. We haven't had a controversial arbitration decision. That's all in that period. We haven't had the active phase of island building, although we still had some development on Chinese-controlled landforms. And right now, the prospects of new arbitration claims seem extremely low, given how the last one played out. Talk of a South China Sea air defense identification zone has receded, and we haven't had any particularly problematic encounters at sea between the U.S. Navy and the People's Liberation Army Navy. That said, I think there's reason to believe that the lull may only be temporary. First of all, a few years is not a very long time in the history of a dispute of this magnitude and this complexity. And a number of small incidents and developments have caused serious problems in the past as they've escalated. The escalation risk is not gone, even though the plan and the U.S. Navy and the Coast Guard, for that matter, are pretty good at handling these incidents. There are some civilian ships out there too, and things can escalate. There is the occasional not so well-trained person in one form of service or another, and we've got to worry about things like unmanned craft, which we don't really have very good rules for. So there are incidents possibly there, and we've certainly seen irritants even in the last few years. China continues to chafe at U.S. freedom of navigation operations. The U.S. continues to chafe at what China has done to establish greater military capacity on the 7 landforms, including landing a bomber recently, putting in aircraft, anti-aircraft and anti-ship missiles, and so on. And of course, the recent statements by Secretary Mattis at Shangri-La and the disinvitation from RIMPAC show that there are risks of friction, including U.S.-China bilateral friction, that may come back to haunt us in one form or another. So I would share the premise that I think some of my other colleagues in the panel will say, that the U.S. and China do have significant shared interests in the region. Shared interests in peace and stability, shared interests in access to the maritime commons for at least some purposes, and in avoiding, of course, a superpower conflict or the risk thereof. That said, there's some pretty fundamental differences in interests, in principles, and in perspectives that are not gone. They're complex. I'll tick through them very quickly. For those of you who know this stuff, it'll sound like old hat. For those of you who don't, it will sound like rapidly spoken gibberish, but I just want to give you a sense of how many issues and how complex they are. I think they can be boiled down into 2 categories. One is a disagreement about geographic claims, about sort of physical space, if you will. And here the U.S. and China take very different views. Whose landforms are they? China says they all belong to China. The U.S. is agnostic. Other claimants make claims too. What is the status of these landforms? How much of a maritime zone can they generate? The U.S. sees a lot of them, as did the Arbitration Commission, as not perhaps warranting a territorial sea, much less an EEZ. China, at least implicitly and sometimes explicitly, sees these landforms as generating maritime zones under the law of the sea. Now, I'd note that the Arbitration Commission probably went a bit farther than the U.S. is comfortable with, because we have some Taipingdao or Ituaba-like islands that we use for our own zones, but that's neither here nor there. China's claims are physically expansive in the U.S. view because of the drawing of straight baselines in the Xisha and the Paracels, and the possibility that China will do it elsewhere. The at least hinting at a claim of archipelagic status for some of the clusters of landforms in the South China Sea. And what, with the 9-dash line and other mechanisms, is at least an implicit demarcation of potentially overlapping zones in a way that the U.S. sees as taking a somewhat one-sided view of how you would allocate those kinds of competing and overlapping claims. And of course, perhaps most prominently, anything that the 9-dash line means that goes beyond it merely being the dotted line that encloses the territory over which China claims sovereignty, and then deriving law of the sea consistent maritime zones therefrom, including historic rights issues. Again, the Arbitration Commission decision is not wildly out of line with a lot of U.S. positions. So there's a lot going on there, and those issues are not going away. China and the U.S. have, as I said, fundamentally different views. The U.S. views are set forth pretty authoritatively in the Limits on the Seas paper, and they've been pressed in some respects through freedom of navigation operations, which have continued from the Obama administration into the Trump, with roots before that. And I think we're going to see that continue, particularly as more military capacity is installed on the Chinese-controlled landforms in the South China Sea. Now here I've also been asked in Hong Long's initial charge here to address what this means for U.S. relations with some of the other states, the other rival claimant states to China in the region. And here the U.S. interests and positions are aligned but far from perfectly. So let's look at some of the disalignment, if you will. One is, of course, the U.S. is agnostic on sovereignty claims, whereas China and its rivals all have very strong views on who has sovereignty over these landforms. Secondly, there are, of course, rival claims among the other claimants. It's not China against everybody, it's everybody against everybody, again, with the exception of the United States. But most importantly here, the U.S., of course, does not claim any sovereign interests of its own. That is an asymmetry with China's interests that China has, I think, pressed quite effectively in the politics of discussing these issues, saying this really isn't your issue, except in a more diffuse, principle-based sense rather than a concrete interest. The second set of issues where I think there's an even more profound conflict between U.S. and Chinese views are more conceptual or jurisdictional in terms of law of the sea rules. Here again, I can tick through a long list rather quickly. The U.S. rejects any implications from some Chinese positions that some or indeed much of the water in the South China Sea is internal or sovereign waters. The U.S. does not accept territorial seas claims, certainly where they're not officially declared, and not in many cases because of the view that either sovereignty is disputed or the landforms are too small to generate the zones. But more importantly, the U.S. rejects the notion that it must seek permission or give notice for operations, freedom of navigation operations, which it often avoids classing as innocent passage, which is what you'd have to do in a territorial sea. But the interesting stuff here is really the exclusive economic zone and beyond. Here, China has at least occasionally moved toward positions that maritime scientific research includes surveillance, the notion that there are security rights in the EEZ that are not fully captured, perhaps, in the Law of the Sea Treaty, and the notion that the EEZ list simply is not exhaustive or allows coastal states' rights more than what the U.S. sees as a high seas minus position. ADIZs are another, of course, controversial area. And then finally, at the farthest reaches, the non-zonal claims that extend to the high seas, as well as within closer zones, where China has articulated arguments such as the U.S. Navy's operations sometimes show a lack of due regard for the interests of the coastal state, China, in exercising rights, that the U.S. may be abusing its rights under the law of the sea, even if it has them, and that some U.S. activities are inconsistent with the obligation, the general obligation of peaceful use of the high seas, and to some degree, the argument that there are sort of more diffuse customary international law rights in the oceans which have survived the advent of the Law of the Sea Treaty. And finally, the general international legal obligations concerning threats or use of force. All of these have to varying degrees been arguments that China has put out to criticize U.S. operations, and the U.S. has, of course, insisted all these operations are perfectly permissible. This is a pretty profound set of disagreements on a pretty big set of rules. They're all in the Chinese repertoire, they're all in the US pushback, a repertoire manifested through FONOPS, surveillance activities, and legal argument. So here too, the US has positions that align somewhat well, but hardly perfectly, with the rival claimant states in the region, some of which are US allies, others of which are US friends. The US is basically pushing a relatively open seas regime. Hillary Clinton probably most famously articulated this in the ASEAN conference in Hanoi in 2010. And here there's an alignment with rival claimants to China in the South China Sea area, where there are states that feel themselves understandably overmatched by China's growing military capacity, and a wariness both of general operations by the People's Liberation Army Navy and by the possibility of further buildup on the landforms where the bases have been created. But there's some significant divergences here too. Regional states, several of them, share China's views and not the US views on some of these more expansive notion of coastal state rights in the zones. The US has a bit of a hypocrisy problem on the air defense identification zones, which have an iffy basis in international law. The US says the one China established in the East China Sea is a little bit much, but the US does these too. And finally, of course, there is the big asymmetry, which China also has used very effectively in diplomatic discussions here, which is last time we checked, the US was not a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, the US, of course, has quite plausible arguments that customary international law embodies all of that, but still it's a weak talking point. Now that I've all bored you to death, if you're not Law of the Sea junkies, or even if you are, because then you know all this stuff, I want to turn a little bit to what I think is the broader picture here in my last couple of minutes. And here I think is the nub of the matter. Underlying all those specific issues is a basic position where the US sees itself as defending a rule-based international legal order centered on UNCLOS, which the US hasn't joined, and sees itself as providing international public goods of an open maritime commons, peace and stability in the region, from which China has benefited, and sees a potential threat to that order in some of the things that China is doing, particularly militarizing and building up the landforms. On the other hand, China's view is profoundly different. China sees this as an issue of China reasserting its sovereign powers over sovereign territory, and sees the US as undertaking an assertive, perhaps even aggressive policy by parking the US Navy right on China's doorstep and within 12 nautical miles of the landforms, where the US has no reason to be doing this because China has no desire to enclose the seas or kick the US out. That's a pretty basic difference of perspective. It's almost a security dilemma in IR terms, although probably not quite. So the thing I've left out that I'll close with is the big, slightly orange-colored elephant in the room. Is there something changing with the Trump administration in the United States, such that these old patterns, these old bases of partial cooperation but a fair amount of conflict are fading? Well, To some extent, we've seen changes on the rival claimant side. The Philippines is in a very different position under Duterte than it was under the previous administration. Look at what it did with the arbitration decision. Vietnam, Malaysia, and others seem not to be so keen on bringing their own arbitration claims, given recent developments. And there have been patterns of cooperation and some conflict over resource development. I'll leave the questions of whether there's been change on the China side to my colleagues on the panel. So let me just close with addressing the US side and what may be going on here. In terms of the Trump effect, there is perhaps a fundamental one in that he does not see the US's national security interests, as so bound up with traditional commitments to allies and friends in the region. That has underpinned a lot of the way the US has approached the South China Sea issues. And he does not seem terribly interested in the deep US investment in supporting a multilateral global governance set of international rules like UNCLOS, where the US has always been a little squishy anyway. Then there is the more small-bore, simple chaos effect of Trump. He can intervene in issues where he feels like it in ways that diverge from traditional understandings of US security interests and commitments. Think of the South Korea so-called war games, which have been put into suspension, or the idea that the fine on ZTE might be linked to trade disputes, even though it is grounded in national security concerns. And there are areas where he seems to act on the basis of good personal relationships with Kim, with Xi, perhaps with Abe, perhaps with Duterte, and not so much with some other leaders, such that US policy may be defined by those or affected by those kinds of relationships rather than traditional calculations. That all may sound good for China. It suggests a US stepping back from a number of positions that have been irritants for China and harms to Chinese interests in the near seas. But let me close finally with some cautions about why this might not be so good. First, traditional US national security policy may actually have some ballast and some momentum. The Trump derangements easily get exaggerated, they may not be enduring, and we may return back to where we were. And to the extent there are long-term changes, they aren't just Trump, they're deeper rooted in a much more gradual erosion of US dominance and a sense of the limits to US power. The Mar-a-Lago spirit appears to be real, but spirits can be rather fleeting and evanescent. Trump is capable of suddenly deciding his best friend is his worst enemy, although perhaps more often the other way around. And we've seen signs of this in the incipient trade war, in the national security strategy documents, and so on. And last but not least, the iconoclasm of Trump is also a transactional approach to foreign policy. So China and others have to worry that somehow the issues we're talking about on this panel will wake up tomorrow morning and they've been linked to the issues on other panels. That creates uncertainty, that creates potential volatility and conflict. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to the Institute for inviting me here today. I'm honored and humbled to be speaking besides these respected academics and thought leaders. I see on the screen here at the panel 3, South China Sea. I think if you reference your programs, it's actually South China Sea and areas of US-China Maritime Cooperation. And I will be speaking specifically to the areas where the United States and China have their greatest maritime cooperation, and building on some of those comments that Ambassador Bolton made over lunch. Cooperation is essential to all of the operations that the United States Coast Guard engages in, both internationally and domestically. Cooperation is perhaps most evident and most needed in the combat against IUU, or illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And that will be the primary focus of the remarks that I will give now. Although I will touch on other areas where the United States and China indeed have strong maritime cooperation. So what is the IUU threat? It's an economic problem, first and foremost. A World Bank study this year indicated that in 2012, there were $82 billion worth of lost economic product from overfishing. Vast majority of that could be categorized as IUU fishing. IUU fishing is a destabilizing force in the Asia-Pacific region. The Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that approximately 68% of the world's oceans are fully fished, and approximately 31% of the world's oceans are overfished. Demand for fish is expected to increase through 2030, approximately 4.3 billion people around the world use fish as a primary source of protein. And as population growth continues to rise, demand for fish products will also continue to rise. So we have rising demand, we have dwindling stocks. That indeed is, I would assert, a recipe for instability. IUU is prevalent for really 4 reasons. The actors who engage in IUU fishing are able to exploit the gaps between governance of various nation states. And on top of that, within the nation states, the resources that are used to combat IUU fishing are also in demand by other critical missions, be it search and rescue, national security, or environmental response, or other national priorities that take those dollars that might have been used to combat IUU fishing and put them somewhere else. There's an attractive profit to risk ratio for IUU fishing. Since you're exploiting the gaps between international governments, your risk of getting caught is fairly low. Since you're going to where the fish are most prevalent, your profits are at their peak, and thus there's incentive for bad action. It requires minimal skill. And I say this not to take anything away from fishermen, but quite frankly, it doesn't take more to fish illegally from a skill set than it does to fish legally. And if anything, arguably there's less skill required when you're not complying with the rules. And then finally, at market, it's hard to discern the difference between a legally caught fish and an illegally caught fish. If I walk down the street and I go into a supermarket and there's a salmon sitting there, I honestly cannot tell you whether that has been caught legally or illegally. And by buying it, I may be feeding into the pockets of illegal fishing. So a little bit of a background on my organization before I launch into how we cooperate with international partners to combat IUU fishing and other threats. The Coast Guard is born out of the United States Revenue Cutter Service, which was first established in 1790, so we have a long pedigree. And we first really got into the business of living marine resource protection when the United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. At that time, there were fur traders that were taking pelts illegally up in Alaska, and the Revenue Cutter Service was sent up to far north, far away from the closer U.S. shores to engage in protecting that living marine resource. Today, we are 42,000 strong. We have less than 200 cutters or ships at our beckon, and we are tasked with protecting 95,000 miles of U.S. coastline and 3.4 million square nautical miles of U.S. exclusive economic zone. Whilst we too have 11 or 10 other competing statutory missions that we must parse our resources against. So with that backdrop, we also realize that the fish that are the focus of the IUU fishers don't recognize geopolitical boundaries. And so whilst I just told you all that we have to do in protecting the U.S. exclusive economic zone, the fish are going to and fro on hot waters of the high seas and in other exclusive economic zones. So that's really where it becomes pertinent that we partner with other sovereigns to get after this IUU threat. So now I'll go into some of those areas of cooperation. Some of those areas that I'll speak of will be building directly on Ambassador Bolton's comments. I'll start with the Safe Ocean Network. Safe Ocean Network is a global network made up of governments, industry, and civil society that works together to share information and take action to strengthen the global fight against IUU fishing, including detection, enforcement, and prosecution. To date, the network has brought together 27 governments and 19 organizations engaged in more than 40 projects worth more than $82 million to counter the IUU fishing. So this year, the Coast Guard has worked with our Department of State and other partners to provide law enforcement support and training in areas that are of interest to the Safe Ocean Network. and 3 of those to highlight as we're working with Pacific Island nations to protect and improve subject matter expertise for shipwriters. In Southeast Asia, close to the regions that we're talking about here, we're having a 5-day training workshop to enable participants to better enforce fisheries laws and regulations and help prevent, deter, and eliminate IUU fishing. And in the Bay of Bengal, we're putting on a workshop to share best practices across India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Moving even closer to our partner of the day, the topic of the day here, and the U.S.-China Cooperation specifically, I'll speak to the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. The North Pacific Coast Guard Forum was initiated by the Japanese Coast Guard in 2000 and is a venue to foster multilateral cooperation through information sharing on matters related to combined operations, exchange of information, illegal drug trafficking, maritime security, fisheries enforcement, illegal migration, and maritime domain awareness. Participants to the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum include China, Canada, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Russia, and the United States. Every year since 2000, the forum has held both principals meetings and alternatingly subject matter experts or technical meetings semi-annually. And those meetings have gone across all of the countries that are partners to the forum. Just a recent headline earlier this month, Six Nation Coast Guard Forum simulates IS terror attack on cruise ship. Big difference there between simulates and stimulates in that statement. So that was out of the FE News Agency on June 7th. And just one line from that. In order to eliminate the terrorists quickly, counter-terror teams from Korea, Russia, and China were moved in from the sky and sea simultaneously, according to state-provided media from the Korean Foreign Press. So that is one example of an area where we are cooperating in a non-fisheries context. But there's more. The North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, in fact, does sponsor operations. And so right now we have Operation North Pacific Coast Guard 2018. Ambassador Bolton spoke to the memorandum of understanding that the United States and China have on regards to United Nations Security Resolution 46/215, which speaks specifically to the high seas drift nets fishing. And that has been in place for the past 25 years, since 1993. In that time, China has provided a total of 109 enforcement officials to deploy on board Coast Guard assets, and that is ongoing today. So right now, there are Chinese PRC shipwriters on the Coast Guard cutter Alex Haley as it is steaming through the East China Sea. I had the opportunity, it's my job. I was working on this weekend, and on Friday, the Alex Haley came across a vessel that was approximately 800 miles off of Japan that seemed to be engaged in high seas drift net fishing. The vessel was flying a PRC flag, and the indicia around the vessel indicated that indeed was a Chinese vessel. On Saturday morning, a combined boarding team of the United States and the PRC shipwriters boarded the vessel, led by the PRC shipwriters, and in fact found that it had 1 ton of squid on board and 80 tons of salmon, as well as 8 kilometers of high seas drift nets that was divided into 4-kilometer segments. Under the applicable United Nations General Assembly resolution, it is prohibited to have any high seas drift net longer than 2.5 kilometers. So you might say that this vessel was caught red-handed. It is indeed was a PRC vessel, 29 Chinese nationals on board. The Coast Guard cutter Alex Haley is currently escorting it through the East China Sea, where it will rendezvous with Chinese enforcement vessels that will take this vessel home for enforcement action. So I think that is really a prime example of how, whilst we have many areas that we do not see eye to eye. South China Sea perhaps being foremost that I'm aware of. There are areas certainly where we have strong cooperation in the maritime arena. And because of time, I'm not even going to speak to the fact that we have a search and rescue agreement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Robert, please. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, President Wu and Dr. Hong, for the opportunity to be here. It's really a great pleasure to be with such a distinguished group, and thank you to the Institute and the other organizers as well. I teach a course called Law and USChina Relations, in which the animating question is whether and how the United States and China can peacefully coexist in the 21st century, sort of what I consider to be the great geopolitical question of our age. And we explore the role that laws and legal institutions can play in helping to meet that challenge. We ask questions like, what is the future of the international order going to be? What kind of rising power will China be? The South China Sea in many ways remains, in my view, a crucible for all of these grand questions. And so from a U.S.-China relations perspective, when you're thinking about the interests involved from a U.S. strategist standpoint, that sort of hovers above everything else. I think it's very consistent with what Jacques already introduced. The sort of list of interests, I think he very thoroughly laid out, and they'll be familiar to many of you, but of course the United States takes no position on sovereignty disputes, but we do have a position on how those disputes are resolved, namely that they should be resolved peacefully and not through coercion, intimidation, threats, or use of force. Freedom of the seas, extremely important interest that's, I think, somewhat, or in some cases, misunderstood and perhaps even underappreciated. Regional alliances and partnerships, which create interests or entail interests in lending support to those allies and demonstrating willingness to live up to the commitments that we've made. In addition, an interest in countries avoiding taking unilateral, destabilizing, or provocative actions that disrupt the status quo. And of course, the U.S. believes that China's large-scale island construction and militarization has done exactly that. And then the U.S., of course, has some more specific disputes with China that implicate issues in the South China Sea. Jacques ran through them very well. These include things like the right of coastal states to regulate foreign military activities in the EEZ. But more broadly, despite what President Wu identified as the period of relative calm, at least as compared to a few years ago, I would say there remain three sort of big issues. First, I'll address freedom of navigation. I think we need to understand that this is not only, at least from a U.S. perspective, about the high seas, but also importantly, as Professor Nordquist indicated previously in his remarks, about freedom of navigation in exclusive economic zones as well. It's an important principle bearing on peace and economic prosperity. But to the United States, it's actually even more than that. I would commend to you a recent book, just published the other day, actually, by James Kraska and Raul Pedroso, called The Free Seas. And if you ask someone like Professor Kraska, he would tell you that, for more than 100 years, the cornerstone of U.S. national security strategy has been focused on preventing the rise of a hostile hegemonic power in Europe or Asia. And that freedom of the seas is essential to that strategy because the seas connect the United States with its allies, friends, and partners in these regions. Okay, so freedom of navigation first. Second, as Jacques alluded to, the sort of rules-based system that we often hear about. I share the skepticism of some who worry about the prospects for negotiation of a robust and legally binding code of conduct among the claimant states in the South China Sea. And I think that leaves us basically with UNCLOS as our best bet, even though it doesn't, of course, address the underlying sovereignty disputes. And I think there are real questions widely shared about whether China will adhere to the rules set forth in UNCLOS. Of course, it must be said that the U.S. has been in a rather awkward position, having not ratified UNCLOS. And surely, as Jacques mentioned as well, there are parts of the 2016 tribunal decision that U.S. officials are probably not entirely comfortable with, given that we claim 200 nautical miles EEZs over a number of features in the Pacific that would probably be considered rocks under the tribunal's logic. But now the challenge is even more complicated because, as Wang Jise put it in Foreign Affairs just a few days ago, and I quote, "In recent years, Americans have often asked China to follow the rules-based liberal international order. It has become harder and harder for foreign policymakers in China to discern what rules the Americans want themselves and others to abide by, what kind of world order they hope to maintain, and where Washington is on major international issues," end quote. I think that's a legitimate critique. No matter what Secretary Mattis might say at the Shangri-La Dialogue about rules and norms and the free and open Indo-Pacific, the message is muddled when, for example, a day earlier, the U.S. announced steel and aluminum tariffs against our allies in the name of national security, which one might argue threatens to destabilize the rules-based trading system of the WTO that the United States helped establish. Nonetheless, despite the sometimes chaotic environment that we're seeing, I think Professor DeLille is right to suggest that the world is indeed watching and asking the question, specifically looking at the South China Sea and China's actions with respect to its neighbors, asking the question, is China an expansionist power? Not just assertive, right, but expansionist. Secretary Mattis, again at the Shangri-La Dialogue, indicated that up until a few months ago, the approach basically was to seek cooperation as the sort of primary, the core of the approach, and that the landing, after the anti-ship missiles, the surface-to-air missiles, the electronic jammers, the landing of bomber aircraft at Woody Island, that the approach needs to basically change a bit to reflect new realities. I would say, let's face it, China's South China Sea strategy has been a huge success from Beijing's perspective. I think China has been able to strengthen its position at relatively little cost in soft power and reputational damage. So given that, I personally would have thought that now would be the time not to press that advantage harder, but rather to provide some reassurance to neighbors in the region. So what would that look like? Again, these may be familiar to folks here, but of course, ceasing further upgrading and militarization of the islands, that has not happened. Clarifying the 9-dash line, what it means, has not happened. Not drawing straight baselines to enclose the Spratly Islands, as China has done with the Paracels. That has not happened yet, but there are some indications that perhaps it may still be in the offing. And then finally, and more broadly, showing some global leadership on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I think, Ambassador Bolton pointed to some very important constructive initiatives in which China is engaged when it comes to issues like fishing and other forms of cooperation. I think we need to spend some more time emphasizing those things. But in addition, I think if China were to take other steps, more concerted steps to recognize UNCLOS's constraints, that would be in China's interest, particularly given ongoing competition in the Arctic as the ice melts and opportunities for transit and resource exploitation emerge. So if China does not do these things, if, for example, there is continued interference in oil and gas exploration, if, we see continued reports of depriving Filipino fishermen of their catch off of Scarborough, I think it makes it more likely that things like the so-called Quad framework, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, whatever might be encapsulated by that catchphrase, that they may actually gain some traction and some real momentum. That U.S.-Vietnam relations will continue to grow warmer, that domestic opposition in the Philippines to President Duterte's approach to China may grow louder, and so on. which then raises a question, at what point will the United States, alongside allies and partners, take a more forceful step? And I don't mean, a disinvitation to RIMPAC. My own view is that freedom of navigation operations are probably necessary, but not sufficient. So I think U.S. policymakers are continuing to ask themselves the question, what other tools are available? Does there come a point when the U.S. decides to use economic leverage to try to dissuade China from regional expansionism? What happens if, for example, a U.S. company like Exxon is involved in drilling off of Vietnam and there's interference there? So these are important questions, and I don't have good answers to them, I confess to you. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that regardless of what might be at the top of President Trump's agenda at a particular moment, China's actions and interactions in the South China Sea have become a lens through which many of China's other actions are interpreted by U.S. strategists. So that includes things like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Doklam Corridor standoff with India last year, even to some extent North Korea, I would argue. And I think that makes for a very precarious situation. So the last thing I'll say, the United States does not have an interest in dominating the South China Sea. But the U.S. does have a very strong interest in ensuring that no one country does dominate it. So that doesn't mean, I'll just repeat, that does not mean that leaders in Washington have come to any kind of consensus for where to draw that line, how to strategically enforce it. But that's the basic challenge from a U.S. perspective. So I'll stop there. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Hong, please.
It's always risky to be the last speaker, and a lot of very good points has been covered by my distinguished peer panelists. I'll make sure I won't be the last one next round of next year's conference. And I think what I can offer is a Chinese perspective on this particular topic, given the fact that living and working in town, and also as a Chinese scholar, I hope I will be in a good position to share with you both sides of the story. So I am going to talk a little bit about the status quo of South China Sea from the views and perspective of China as a regional state and also as a major claimant. We might see different picture in different links. And then I'm going to explain from my point of view why the South China Sea becomes such a compelling issue in the U.S.-China relations. And last but not the least, hopefully to give a very humble thought about what is a rational choice for the two of us. So looking at the status quo of South China Sea from a regional state's perspective, let's look at a bilateral relationship between all these claimants. Let's take the Philippines as one example, and Philippines has been trying to normalize relationship with China ever since July 2016, and we see a lot of high-level meeting, and we see a lot of agreements signed by these two countries, and we also see further and further cooperation between these two countries in a lot of areas like law enforcement. And we see the Philippines, they send their Coast Guard personnel to be trained in China and have very good exercise in China. And then also let's look at a country like Vietnam. And also Vietnam is showing a good sign to improving its relationship with China. And the two countries discussing, they should learn from their experience when they have this first maritime boundary on Gulf Tonkin. They should learn from their experience and then try a way to solve the issues or difference in the South China Sea. So we see quite a stable and improving bilateral relationship among the claimants, despite some small-scale spat, as we heard from already from other panels. And the other factor, when I look at the status quo, we see a being enhancing role for China and ASEAN to play in the South China Sea. I can give a couple of examples. I'm not going to go over it. For instance, in the last summit, ASEAN summit back in November 2016, we hear all the state leaders from the Philippines, and as the chairman of ASEAN, and they actually make a very good compliment that they try to list the most ranking three threats in China and ASEAN relations. and also non-traditional security in the region. They talk about piracy, they talk about armed robbery, but they never mention South China Sea as a threat in the region. And also the Vietnamese leader also praised hardly and how it has been achieved through the effort between China and ASEAN. And Singapore as the chairman of ASEAN this year, and they also talk about very positively how China and ASEAN is working, for instance, pushing the COC negotiation. And those examples actually show, at least to me, is the fact that China and ASEAN are playing more and more important role in getting the South China Sea to the right track. And there is currently a lot of discussion on promoting regional cooperation in this region, and a lot of very concrete regional cooperation projects has been halted or postponed in the past 3 years during those confrontation arising from a lot of different factors. So currently we're talking about, for instance, joint cooperation like joint development, and we see some ongoing discussion between China and the Philippines. So the two countries, they have a government level, they have very strong political will to pursue this. But there is some technical problem, for instance, to how to define the area of joint development, but see a good sign. And we also heard from Ambassador Bolton, then the US and China also involved in area-based management posts in the South China Sea, and that is also one of the areas that China and other claimant states working on, whether we can find a good approach despite all this sovereignty and maritime difference, and maybe we should look at a common approach, like area-based, for instance, to find an area for marine protected area. And we're also looking at all these countries are involved in the BBNJ negotiation. So that's the positive part I want to emphasize. And certainly there are many uncertainties. One of the major uncertainties, as we hear why we put this panel together, we see the US factor playing a quite important role in the South China Sea. So these two countries are merely confrontation, whether phone-up or whether we're talking about China's land reclamations. And then there's two very important strategy reports from the US, the 2017 National Defense Strategy Report and also the National Defense Strategy Report actually refer China as a rival power aggressively undermining American interests around the globe, but it's quite sharp accusations. And there's one uncertain factor, and there's also other uncertain factor will involve in the engagement with other non-claimant states like Japan and Australia, who also have legitimate interests, but the manner and the way they approach these issues might worry the Chinese government. And then I would like to explain from my point of view why the South China Sea becomes such a compelling issue. So we see a lot of symptoms. We are talking about more and more freedom navigation and closer to Chinese shore. And we're talking about Secretary of Defense Mattis' statement in the Shangri-La dialogue. And that shows us the fact that the South China Sea will come back one of the few top issues in affecting China relations. If we look back in January, when our institute will have a couple of roundtable discussion, and we try to identify those top 3 elements might affect the U.S.-China relations. Back in January, we're talking about DPRK, we're talking about trade, and we tend to agree that maybe in the very near future, 1 or 2 years, we don't have a chance to talk about the South China Sea anymore. I start worrying about my journal article, I don't have a place to publish. But only 6 months, we see a lot of change, and the South China Sea come back to the core stage, affecting China-U.S. relations. So why is that? I think, first of all, it's both a geopolitical competition, and it's also a competition for power distribution in Asia-Pacific, and a competition who will be superior in that regions. And the second reason, I think the maritime strategy defines the behavior and policy in this region. So why I say so? My understanding for the U.S. strategy is to maintain the sea dominance and as an important parameter in U.S. leadership globally. So the South China Sea domination is very important for the United States. And to look at Chinese maritime strategy, we're talking about, if I can read it to you, and the Chinese maritime strategy is to enhance our capacity for exploiting marine resources, develop the marine economy, protect the marine economic environment, and safeguard China's maritime rights. That's very important to understand how important the sovereignty claims and maritime rights it means to China. So with two different maritime strategies in mind, and it's very rational to understand why these two countries does not agree with each other on many of the issues. So when we talk about, for instance, U.S. and China engagement in the South China Sea, I think I want to focus on three topics, and we already hear. The first one, how we differ, what is the discourse of freedom navigation, and the other one is the rule of law issues, and then the so-called militarization issues. Let me start with the freedom navigation. We hear from Professor Norquist. Well, freedom navigation legally, it's very important. It's a very good, it's a part of freedom on the high sea. We all agree with that. So China and the United States should be on the same page on how important free navigation is. But I think the difference is actually how to understand the navigation regime. Like, for instance, particularly in China's case, in the territorial sea, we're talking about innocent passage, but we do require permission from the coastal state when warship trying to exercise innocent passage. And the other difference on the navigation regime is about some certain types of military activity we might have impact on the coastal states, like marine environments, and also might have or be considered as marine scientific research, and then you will need the coastal state's permission. So the idea or the difference is not really about the freedom navigation, it's all about this navigation regime in different interpretations. But the interesting fact is, because I read this American freedom navigation report annually, and they are pointing to all these countries like in the South China Sea, they are criticizing Vietnam, Malaysia, they are all basically putting at individual claimant states. But why the freedom navigation becomes such a compelling issue between China and the United States? I will argue that the two countries represent two very different interest groups. One as a coastal state, like very close, and we're looking at coastal states' interest, and the other represent the maritime powers' interest. We are looking at more open sea. That's the difference. And then my question is, I totally agree with my peer fellows' appointment that freedom navigation, we should not worry or we should not be too panicked about that, legally speaking. But that worry me and worry a lot of Chinese about the manner and the timing that the United States conducted free navigation. So my question here is, why the United States free navigation is such a big issue? So is it its legal substance and element and function lost in translation when we have this very big political agenda which shadows legal meaning of freedom navigation? So I would like to point out the experience between the United States and Canada in dealing their different issues in the Arctic. For instance, the Northwest Passage is considered by Canada as the internal water, while the United States considered as international strait for use. So they work perfectly how to deal with each other, which means they agree to disagree. You keep your position, I keep my position, and then every time when the U.S. Coast Guard, icebreaker want to sail through the Northwest Passage, they will ask permission for the Canada, and they will normally say yes. So this is a very practical approach to deal with the issues, and also between United States and Russia on the northern sea route. I read a comment from Coast Guard Admiral Chunkov, and he made a statement that, well, we are not seeing the necessity of doing FONAP in the northern sea route, but in the future, depending on Russia's a lot of the domestic policy in terms of navigation issues. So when I compare these two, the South China Sea and Arctic, in this particular topic of free navigation, I see some similarities there. They represented the competing interests of coastal states and U.S. states, and there's a lot of difference because like in the Arctic, we see a low politics, but on the South China Sea, you see a high politics. And also perception actually matters a lot because, like, for instance, between Canada and U.S., and they consider each other as like good neighbor, but I'm not quite sure in the future given the trade issues. But when we talk about U.S. and China, the perception matters a lot because they try to consider each other interfering a lot in these issues. So some will argue, I think many of my American colleagues will argue that stepping up the U.S. naval confrontation of China will portray America as a protector of vulnerable country true to its commitment and a guarantee of international rule-based order. But it is, for instance, if we understand from a Chinese perspective, and to be viewed, could be viewed as destabilization, outside interference in these regional affairs. And the second question I want to talk about, because often we hear too much about the term militarization, because the two countries are actually accusing each other of playing that role. So militarization means different things for China and to the United States. So to China, the emplacement of defensive weapons does not constitute militarization. So in Chinese view, unfortunately, the U.S. has a clearly military and continue to militarize the region with its forward deployed troops and patrols and boosted by rebalance of its defense force, given the Quad and Indo-Pacific strategy slogan as well. And then another point of question I would like to share with you is about how we define the rule of law. Because U.S., when it defines or when it talk about Chinese policy in the South China Sea, it often call China to follow the rule of law. I will argue that there's a misleading understanding or misleading narration about Chinese attitude on international law and also on its law of the sea interpretation. So, and it's not very rational to come to a conclusion that China does not abide by international law simply because it does not participate in the South China Sea arbitration case. And there's a lot of reason for China not to do that in terms of legally arguing about the jurisdiction admissibility and also about a lot of the merits issues. Yes, thank you. And there is also, I can point out many very good examples that China saw very perfectly how and it actually rely on international law to solve many of its issues. And then I think I have my time coming up. So my last point is I want to share some very humble thoughts. What might be the rational choice for the future? I am not ambitious to say I have very thoughtful recommendation, but I think it's very important to sort out the convergence and diversion and find a way on a comfortable and acceptable way for both countries to make the way out. And I would like to also echo Bob's comments about agree on non-dominance approach. I think both countries should come to the consensus that none of the countries actually should pursue a domination role in these regions. And then I would like to, the least point, I think, given all those aspects and difference between China and the States, and we are lucky to have many mature confidence-building measures, including the 1998 MMCA and also the 2014 Counter for Unplanned Encounter at Sea and other MOUs, which make sure, despite all the difference, that we are working together perfectly how in order to avoid incidents at sea and also in order to avoid the next escalation of the issues. And with that, I finished.
Okay, thank you, Hong-Long. Great. So, informative and engaging remarks made by our four speakers. Now, before I open the floor for discussion, I would enjoy my privilege as chair to ask questions for our speakers. I will ask for each of our speakers 4 questions equally, just for facilitating discussions. To Jack, you just mentioned in your presentation, if we look at the current situation in the South China Sea, you might agree with me that the military confrontation in the South China Sea between China and the United States, now becoming a driving force to drive the South China Sea upwards and down. So from your perspective, what would be the future, evolution or outlooks of such military confrontation in the South China Sea region? What would be possible scenarios in the future in the South China Sea region? To Mark, you just mentioned in your presentation many areas potential area for China and the United States cooperation. Particularly, you just mentioned the IUU and the fishery cooperations in the West Pacific region. But my question is concerning the queues, Code of Unplanned Encounters. Do you think it's possible to apply the queues to our two coast guards, given the fact that the United States may send its coast guard ships to exercise, law enforcement activities in the West Pacific region? Because some U.S. scholars, argue that the United States should send its coast guard ships to the West Pacific region, even in the South China Sea, to exercise law enforcement activities in these regions. To Robert, you mentioned freedom navigation and the law-based system are U.S. interests in the South China Sea region. From your point of view, are there any other interests? For instance, from my perspective, do you think is right the interests of the allies and the partners of the United States in the South China Sea is another interest of the United States? To Hong Nong, from your perspective, even though you didn't mention the joint development, from your perspective, how long it will take for China and the Philippines to reach the final consensus on joint development program in disputed area, given the fact that China and the Philippines are underway to discuss such, cooperation program in the South China Sea region. So I will give the floor to our speakers to address these questions, a quick response. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I think one of the features of U.S.-China relations in the South China Sea is that the temperature will go up and down a lot. And this is one area where I think international lawyers and international relations people may take slightly different takes. The international relations people tend to see it as, we're headed toward a collision, the sort of John Mearsheimer kind of rising power, declining power, or they focus on the very short-term periods of calm and friction. I think the legal take on this, which in this case has a little more political explanatory power, is the issues are sort of the medium-range things. And where a lot of the friction comes from is that day-to-day there are lots of areas where it need not be a problem. It's where we see those moments that the U.S. perceives China as trying to upset the orders, upset the openness regime, coerce other states, and where China sees the U.S. as getting too close to what China sees as core interests, which can be defined more or less expansively. That's where we get into trouble. So I think there are a few stable things here that will point toward avoiding conflict. One is that China's already won on those landforms. I mean, that's happened. The U.S. will continue to do freedom of navigation operations, but Chinese control is real, and the Chinese building up is there, and the U.S. is largely acquiesced in that. And I would urge China to sort of pocket that win and not push it too hard to go to some of the things Robert's suggesting to reestablish confidence. I would say also that it's in China's interest not to push too hard on the sort of openness regimes where I think everybody can sort of live with one another. The other thing that's in China's favor on this, at least for the time being, is that even though the U.S. position is that it is protecting general public goods and general rules of the system, the U.S. nonetheless is partly constrained by the positions of friends and allies in the region. We saw this with the Philippines arbitration, where the Philippines walked back and suddenly the U.S. was left kind of hanging out there, pushing for respect for a process that the claimant of the process didn't seem to respect. So how China treats the rival claimants will affect how much they will essentially give the U.S. room to push China harder. So I think if everybody sort of tries to take the temperature down a little bit, we'll be okay. And finally, I'd say I think there's some wisdom to Deng Xiaoping's old adage of set aside sovereignty and work on concrete areas of cooperation. There is no fundamental legal or international political problem if the parties can agree to jointly manage fisheries, jointly issue leases for hydrocarbon extraction and things of that ilk.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
Thank you very much. For those unfamiliar, CUES is the Code for Unexpected Encounters at Sea. Is agreement between the United States Navy and the PRC's Liberation Army Navy on how ships should interact when they come across each other at sea so as to avoid unfortunate international incidents, to put it mildly. So the CUES does not apply by its letter to the Coast Guards of either nation. That said, so I'm currently in the Office of Maritime and International Law, Chief of Operational Law Division at Coast Guard Headquarters, and my predecessor did engage with, as part of a U.S. delegation, engaged with some of his colleagues in China about developing a similar regime for Coast Guard to Coast Guard or Coast Guard to Navy interactions between our two countries. And ultimately, that did not lead to an agreement. I wasn't here at the time, but I understand there was not much appetite a couple of years ago when that engagement was undertaken. That said, and you'll have to forgive me because I think I'm going to get some of the ministry titles wrong here. My understanding from open source reporting is that either last month or the month before, the Chinese Coast Guard shifted from the police ministry, this is where I'm getting ministries' names incorrect, to fall under the PLAN. And so I would actually turn the question around, and I would ask, now that the Chinese Coast Guard is falling clearly within the military departments of the People's Republic of China, does it not fall under CUES?
Good. Rob? Yeah.
Thank you so much. So the question of the relationship between U.S. interests and the interests of its allies and partners is a particularly difficult one at the present moment. My students find this to be an interesting example. This is sort of a lawyerly diversion, but of our so-called unitary executive theory in the U.S., which is this notion that the president speaks for the entire executive branch, that the executive branch is unified and unitary beneath the president, and that there's that sort of commonality of approach. And I think under the current administration, what we've seen is inconsistency, in some cases at least, between at least some of President Trump's rhetoric with respect to the significance of alliances, the downsides of alliances, in some cases the costs that they sometimes impose on the United States, and the approach that we've seen by people like Secretary Mattis and others within the administration who have really gone out of their way to emphasize the importance of these alliances and partnerships. So I would say a few things. First, given all of that, there is concern among allies and partners in the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, about U.S. withdrawal, about the U.S. sort of retreating from the region, and of course, nothing is more emblematic of that than the abandonment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Second, despite the fact that partners in the region are expressing eagerness for the United States not to withdraw and to be more active and to play a leadership role in the region, they also don't want to choose between the United States and China. And I think that's an important fact that Secretary Mattis very adeptly pointed to in his remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Third, allies and partners in the region are not monolithic. They have diverse interests of their own, not always consistent with each other's interests. And then fourth, there are new players in this story. I think the emergence of players like Indonesia, like India. So I think that all of that makes for a very complicated picture. So I would assess U.S. interests as certainly being closely linked to those of allies and partners in the region. And more broadly, the U.S. has an interest in demonstrating its commitments or its willingness to follow through on those commitments to allies and partners. That's my personal take, but I see a complicated picture at present and perhaps in the coming period.
Okay, thank you. Honong?
I'm not able to foresee very precisely how many years that might take China and the Philippines to reach consensus on joint development. But however, I see a lot of motivation and incentive for both countries. For instance, for China, China's been promoting the idea of joint development since back in the 1980s, but there is not a very successful case in the South China Sea. We see some very concrete, successful example of joint development, but in Gulf Tonkin only involve 2 countries. We see the difficulty, so China would be very keen to see at least one bilateral joint development will come into play. So I think the China and Philippine one might be the one that we will see like a breakthrough of all these difficulty of joint development. This is from Chinese side. And from the Philippine side, when I talk to a lot of Philippine scholars, they are also very keen, despite that the government are still very worried about how to change the constitution to make it fit. Because they're talking about having China as for instance, they are talking China as a joint venture partner, not like a partner of joint development, which legally is very different. But I see there's a lot of economic interest from the Philippines, like a lot of the companies or companies, they're very keen to actually try to step forward and to have Chinese as a partner of joint development and having the technology and the investment for China. And they're very keen to actually to extract the oil from the basin, which will also be very beneficial for the country's economy. So hopefully we'll see the very good model of bilateral joint development between China and Philippines. Hopefully we'll set out a very good example with be over for other bilateral joint development like China and Vietnam, China, and Brunei as well.
Okay, thank you. According to schedule, we still have a couple of minutes to go. The floor is open. Yeah, and then Golden. And Professor Xianqiang, 3 questions. And yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I do have a short comment to Mark's question on China's Coast Guard and the PLAN question and the queues. Well, actually, one thing is incorrect about what you're talking about, the reform of the China Coast Guard. Actually, the China Coast Guard is not under the control of the PLAN, but the People's Armed Police. So that's 2 different organizations. And some people do say that the China Coast Guard now under the control of the armed police means that it is now a paramilitary force, but actually it is not. It is still a civilian agency, and also the main duties and objectives of the Chinese Coast Guard remain the same. And therefore, since it is not an organization of the PLAN, it has nothing to do with the queues. So basically, we're the same as before. So that's my comment on your question.
No question? Okay. Golden?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is for Robert Williams and Jacques Delisle. We might think that China views on maritime law, maritime issues are constant, but I would submit that the views of nations shift over time. If you look at the early 19th century, the United States was deeply concerned about security of its coastline. It fortified its coast, its ports. It was only in the late 19th century when America developed a Great White Fleet, capacity to operate globally, and became a global trading nation, that the shift began to freedom of seas, freedom of trade, etc. Might we not, looking deeper into this 21st century, begin to see a shift on the Chinese views as well, as they develop their naval capacity? They're already the world's leading trading body, trading nation. Could we not see a China more focused on itself, on freedom of navigation and ability for its naval ships and its trading vessels to operate freely abroad, rather than this intense focus on its near coast? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Xianqiang, please.
Thank you. I have a question actually relevant to Bob's one of your point of view. You said that U.S. doesn't want to dominate the South China Sea, but the interest of the U.S. is not to allow any other countries to dominate the South China Sea. But I think, as a kind of a Chinese observer, I think the real policy of the United States is the U.S. will not allow any state to dominate the South China Sea except U.S. itself. And so we can hear that a lot of the kind of argument to push back what China has done and in the South China Sea, and the U.S. has been too soft and should be tougher and something like that. So my question is, if there is a kind of so-called red line in South China Sea concerning the behavior of China, what do you think that the red line would be? And if cross the red line, the red line means U.S. will have some military involvement or behaviors like that. Thank you.
Okay, last one. Yeah, Professor Liu.
Question for Mark. Are you aware if U.S. Coast Guard and Chinese Coast Guard working in Africa, for example, in the Gulf of Guinea, against illegal fishing or piracy? And for Robert, you said freedom of navigation is necessary but not sufficient. Can you clarify what more that U.S. needs to do to maintain the status quo in the South China Sea?
Okay, quick response from our
Certainly,
speaker.
a quick response. So the Coast Guard does work with African nations, partner nations there, pursuant to bilateral agreements that we have with those nations to go after IUU fishing and help those nations enforce their EEZs. That is specific bilateral arrangements not involving China.
Okay, Jack.
To Gordon's question, I completely agree. When I have a longer format, I definitely go down that path, so let me give you the short form of it, which is, yes, we're already seeing signs of it. China is talking about a blue water navy. We've seen China engage in anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. We've seen China do polar expeditions, not with the Navy, but with research ships. And we see China taking a stronger interest in non-traditional security, humanitarian relief efforts, all that. Those are all expanding missions. As China's become more powerful and more secure, it doesn't have to worry about the invasive quality. Right now, China is eminently capable of dealing with any threat in its near seas, except from the United States and in limited ways from Japan. So all of that says, yes, they should start to think like a great power and a great naval power with force projection interests. That discussion's going on from publicly available stuff that you see in PLA Navy journals and among think tank people affiliated. You're starting to see that discussion already. Couple of things, though. It takes a long time for that to percolate up. And I worry a little bit that there still is a friction-producing way where, for some period of time, China may try to square the circle. That is to say, the stuff we're talking about in the South China Sea and to some degree the East China Sea, that's not really law of the sea. That's Chinese territory, territorial waters. It's a way of saying this isn't expansionist, this is merely, at worst, sort of irredentist, taking back lost territory. There's some room to push on that. And I think so long as the U.S. Navy does things that are for sometimes understandable strategic and analytical reasons and sometimes for political posturing reasons, portrayable as a U.S. effort to dominate and keep China down, it's going to keep these older views in the mix. But in the long run, you've got to be right. If I can say one quick thing to Xinjiang's question. One red line is excluding the U.S. Navy from operations. Right? I mean, that would clearly be the kind of thing where there would be a pushback. It need not go to full-scale conflict, but that's the open seas principle that's not givable. Another would be to really shut down commerce, to interdict the passage of trade in a significant way through there. The two squishy areas where I think we'd have to look is a serious complaint from a regional state that it is being coerced by China where it's not a black and white case. How much would the U.S. feel that alliance commitments and commitments to rules would drag us into that, right? Something, a more gray area case. And the other is the risk of escalation. That is something which doesn't start out being on that scale, and nobody wants to go to where the red line is, but you wind up crossing an ill-defined red line through things cascading up, and I think that could easily be things we're now talking about being sort of gray zone conflicts, where it doesn't start out militarily, but it can work up into that area.
Okay, Robert, any response from you?
Well, I thought that was an excellent response, so I would broadly associate myself with Professor DeLille's comments. I mean, one red line that, as I understand it, has been expressed at some point is construction on Scarborough Shoal. And I don't know the current status of that, but part of what I was trying to suggest in my comments is that while you hear a lot of frustration from U.S. policymakers about what China has been doing, how to respond, the need to be doing more, being more active, you don't see much clarity in terms of identifying those red lines beyond some of the important issues that Jacques just mentioned. I would agree with with the idea that China's interest in freedom of navigation may expand, and that's why I was interested in Dr. Hong, your characterization of China as representing a kind of constituency of interests of sort of coastal states, because I see that perhaps moving, and in terms of squaring the circle, this plays out, for example, in the context of the regulation of foreign military activities in the EEZ, right? Because China, of course, has conducted operations in other countries with military vessels in other countries' EEZs, and as I understand it, basically takes the position that it's up to each country to establish what rules it wants to apply in your EEZ. And I wonder how sustainable that view is going forward. I suspect that may begin to fray a bit in the coming years. What more beyond freedom of navigation can the United States do, should the United States do? I think working cooperatively with allies and partners to demonstrate support, build capacity, to help to support and build regional institutions like ASEAN. I think those sound fairly vague, but basically trying to demonstrate that the United States is not going to abandon the region, that we have a desire to work constructively, and at the same time that we're doing all of those things, if it's, for example, helping to build military capacity of allies and partners, I still think it's important to emphasize the cooperative aspects of our relationships with all of the countries in the region, even if we don't, consider them quote-unquote allies or partners. And that very much includes China, and I think that's something that if we are able to bolster regional institutions and provide support to claimant states and states in the region that feel vulnerable at this particular moment, while at the same time emphasizing those areas of cooperation that we're not sort of spoiling for a fight, I think that stands the best chance of being, a sustainable approach over the longer term. But a lot of question marks about the capacity, bandwidth, willingness, and vision, strategic vision currently in the United States to carry that out.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Hong Nong, I don't think you have a question.
I don't.
Okay. Before I conclude this session, please give big hands to our speakers. Thank you.
I think Mark has a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.